In this episode, we are going to talk about the ideas of one of the greatest men of modern times, the great leader who had been able to transform the character of Indian nationalism, who had been able to build bridges with the peasantry, who was successful in drawing in the peasants into the nationalist mobilization. And this man had very clear moral ideas of what his politics was. I mean, ideas of nonviolence, ideas of Satyagraha, all these were embedded in deep philosophical comprehensions about what was the nature of politics, how much of reconciliation needed to be made between the means and the ends, how far was Machiavellism justified. All these questions actually have been debated by historians in their assessment of Gandhi's thought. One should always remember that Gandhi was not a philosopher in the strict sense of the term. He was not an ivory tower intellectual reflecting on philosophical truths at a distance from public life. He was a public man continuously deliberating on what should be the proper moral strategy of political action. And for such reasons, it may be useful to see Gandhi's philosophical ideals as a part of his praxis, in which philosophy and action went hand in hand.
Sir, what is this Gandhian praxis?
In the first place, one should actually clarify the meaning of the term praxis. Praxis is not mere philosophical speculation. Gandhi certainly had deep philosophical ideals to which he pursued throughout his life, but his endeavor was to reconcile these philosophical ideals with his politics, with the needs of the Congress, with the needs of the national movement. He had to convey these ideas to his followers. So, praxis actually implies a certain evolution of ideas over time, depending on the need for the thinker to negotiate with new situations and in the process inventing new ideas. So, praxis doesn't actually create a kind of a hermetically sealed container within which your ideas would circulate. The praxis enables a man to understand this constant evolution of a thinker in the process of negotiating with new situations. So, Gandhi's thoughts, therefore, cannot be simply seen as a philosophical reflection. Gandhi's thought was a part of his praxis, a part of his attempt to build bridges with the people who had not been hitherto mobilized under the rubric of the national movement. So, in an attempt to establish his bridges with the ordinary folks, Gandhi had to recast some of the political ideals into a new language, making it meaningful, making it comprehensible by the ordinary people. This becomes a part of his praxis. So, what Gandhi really was, if one poses this question, was he a liberal or was he a traditionalist? These questions, in my opinion, are not so important. Gandhi certainly was a liberal. Gandhi had cherished certain liberal visions. He was a lawyer. He was familiar with constitutional law. He had been exposed to the principle of rule of law, which he upheld throughout his life. What his intention was to recast these Western ideals into a language which would be indigenous, which would be more comprehensible by his followers. So when we look at Gandhi's ideological moorings, we try to make some sense of what his ideas were regarding politics, regarding morality. One should always keep this basic point in mind, that whatever ideals that you come across in Gandhi's thoughts, whatever philosophical moorings that you come across in Gandhi's thought, whether it is indigenous or Western liberal, they became a part of what we have just described as Gandhian praxis, where theory is a guide to action. And there is always a need to use a certain language which would enable a leader to build bridges or to establish communication with their followers. Now, saying this, one has to get into this whole story of how some of these ideals which Gandhi came to pursue after his emergence as the leading Indian nationalist were formed in an earlier phase of his life. What were the sources of these ideas? Or what could be perhaps the kernel, the central point in his political ideals? One should always remember that when Gandhi arrived in India, there was a need for nationalism to grow into a more broad-based movement. There was a period of dullness. Even Nehru admitted that political situation in India during the war and immediately after the war was dull. So there was an urgency on the part of the leaders to present a person who would be somewhat different, untainted by any political involvement in India, and also capable of developing certain ideals which the Indian followers would find it easier to follow. Gandhi precisely served this purpose by finely blending moderate and extremist methods of agitation. That is, in fact, the very basis of Gandhian praxis. Pursuit of Swaraj was the goal. But then what exactly this Swaraj was, what did he mean by Swaraj, remained undefined for a long time. Gandhi was willing, unlike many of his followers, was willing to accept dominion status if a certain accommodation with the imperial enemy required dominion status as a matter of compromise. Because conflict Gandhi didn't look upon as endemic. There was a continuous search for stability and harmony. So even if imperialism was an evil, and that evil needed to be contained, that evil needed to be fought, the fight with imperialism actually doesn't exclude the possibility of a certain negotiation with imperialism in order to arrive at a certain kind of compromise. So if such compromise demanded dominion status or acceptance of dominion status, Gandhi was willing to accept dominion status. Even after the Purna Swaraj resolution was passed in the Congress session at Lahore in 1929. It was only very late in 1942 Gandhi became very clearly emphatic about complete independence when he gave this call that the English must quit India and must give away powers to Indians. Now, to the extent that Gandhi was willing to work within the broad imperial framework, Gandhi was a moderate. But he was not a moderate. He was actually using extremist methods of agitation, something which is associated with the notion of passive resistance. He was not content with the limited methods of agitation that the moderates had followed. Petitioning the government alone was not what Gandhi practiced. That was not a part of Gandhian praxis. Gandhi wished the people to boycott British goods, boycott British institutions, schools, offices, judicial institutions, wanted people to renounce their titles, give up their practices in order to sever all their connection with imperial government. So here is a man, therefore, who was virtually reworking the extremist program of 1906. But then what is so distinctive in Gandhi? That is where the language of politics comes in as an important dimension of Gandhian praxis, because he was trying to recast this extremist program into a new political language where morality and ethics should figure as an important dimension. Instead of merely accepting the notion that something which is good to pursue should be pursued at any means or at all costs, Gandhi introduced this morality by equating politics with truth, or pursuit of the agitation against imperialism with truth.
Excuse me, sir, how does one see this moral dimension in Gandhian praxis?
Satyagraha, of course. I mean, that is where you can see the moral dimension in Gandhian politics. It's a part of his thought process, it's a part of his ideal, it's a part of his praxis at the same time. Satyagraha is the quest for truth. And so a person who is agitating against the evil of imperialism is actually pursuing truth. There is an unending quest for truth among the fighters for freedom, among the Satyagrahis at a personal level, and that personal feeling of being elevated to a higher plane through pursuit of truth would actually give politics a moral element. Now, one can always debate on what the concept of truth signified. Truth for Gandhi on certain occasions was synonymous with God. On certain occasions, truth was an inner voice, something which arises from one's conscience. Truth in certain occasions was non-violence. But in any case, whether it is God, it is non-violence, it is the inner voice of conscience, all these are interrelated. And the autobiography, the story of my experiments with truth, actually suggests this continuous quest for truth through experiments. And through such experiments, Gandhi was actually thinking of a kind of personal elevation, but at the same time transforming the nature of politics as well. But whatever be the meaning of the truth was, there is no denying that he managed to recast this method of extremist agitation by introducing into it an element of spirituality. And this is precisely what intrigued his opponents. The imperial officials found it difficult to explain what this man was trying to achieve, what this man was saying. They were completely baffled. The deep moral tone that he introduced into political agitation. One central point of this whole idea of Satyagraha was a conscious avoidance of violence. Even though on occasions Gandhi preferred violence to cowardice, but in the whole concept of a non-violent mode of agitation and accepting non-violence as a kind of a spiritually elevating ideal, there was certainly an element of mysticism. Politics is truth, and truth is non-violence. Imperialism represented falsehood. So the fight against imperialism was the quest for truth by following this particular non-violent method of agitation, which was expected to elevate people to a higher level. There is, however, an argument by a scholar called John Bondurant that non-violence implied creative conflict, a path towards moral elevation which required deep philosophical reflection before any action. So you would come across many instances of Gandhi retiring to a chamber when going into fasting before taking a crucial decision. This is one dimension. The other dimension of this creative conflict is the readiness to come to a certain kind of agreement, a certain kind of consensus. It leaves the room open for negotiations. It gives an opportunity to the enemy to arrive at a consensus with you. When you are practicing nonviolence, you are willing to suffer for the cause. You are courageous enough to face the brutal power of imperialism, but at the same time, you are allowing imperialism to change its mind, to come to a certain kind of agreement with you and to arrive at a consensus. So, nonviolence requires peaceful violation of illegitimate laws, courting mass arrest without resorting to any violent action, participating in hartals or strikes, going on fasting. All these are aspects of Satyagraha, the quest for truth. But as I said, there was at the same time a readiness to compromise. If it was needed, it was a readiness to come to some kind of negotiation, some kind of interaction with the imperial opponent. And some critics of Gandhi would say that it also, within the Gandhian praxis, justified withdrawal from a movement at a point of militancy. It happened towards the close of the non-cooperation movement when the movement turned violent at Chauri Chaura. Gandhi went on fasting and decided to withdraw the movement. And this had evoked much criticism from his contemporaries and also from later historians who tried to find out a certain logic in Gandhian nationalism by arguing that while the idea of Satyagraha was actually capable of unleashing a mass movement against imperialism, the idea of Satyagraha, because of this inherent logic, was capable of putting a certain restraint on the movement when these movements threatened to grow into a more militant movement directed against the social stability. So Gandhi was in favor of a certain degree of stability in social life, and whenever such movements threatened to tear social stability asunder, Gandhi would be in a mood to withdraw. But in defense of Gandhi, one might say that this ideal actually managed to reach out to the people, and the people participated in the satyagrahas, giving a measure of strength to the national movement. And one should also have some sympathy for the nationalist leaders who wish to maintain a certain amount of unity in the national movement when this national movement was always likely to be weakened by internal social divisions. There were conflicts among castes, conflicts between communities. So in this kind of a situation, some amount of caution on the part of the leader was perhaps needed to maintain the unity of a unitarian national movement. Now, saying this, one has to go into the roots of Gandhi's ideas at a more philosophical level, because a certain philosophical mooring can always be identified in what I have labeled as the Gandhian praxis. So you have this very important essay by A.L. Basham, which was published in a book called Essays in Gandhian Politics, which has been edited by Ravinder Kumar, in which Basham argues that the roots of his ideas could be traced to indigenous sources, to Jainism, to Buddhism, the Buddhist notion of nonviolence, avoidance of violent action, the Jaina notion of nonviolence, the whole practice of fasting came from the Jaina tradition. Gandhi also absorbed ideas from Vaishnava tradition. He was impressed by the ideal of detachment, which was there in the Bhagavad Gita. So you have a whole range of indigenous religious sources from which Gandhi had derived his ideas. There is an element of dharma in it. Also, Gandhi had seen how the traders in Gujarat actually went on fasting before, in order to protest against the taxes. Such instances happened in the 19th century. So there is always a tendency to see Gandhi's ideas in terms of Indian tradition, Jainism, Buddhism, Vaishnavism, the Bhakti tradition for that matter. These images are cited by Basham in support of his contention that in order to explain Gandhi's ideas regarding Satyagraha, non-violence, or the quest for truth, one has to go to these Indian tradition, this indigenous religious tradition in which Gandhi's ideas were embedded.
Excuse me, sir. Are we to limit the ideological influences on Gandhi to indigenous sources alone, or were there any Western influences also?
No, there were Western influences. Gandhi himself admitted how he was inspired by Henry Thoreau or Ralph Emerson, Ruskin or Tolstoy. Gandhi had a long correspondence with Tolstoy. He was perhaps impressed by Tolstoy's anarchism, but at the same time Tolstoy also impressed upon him the need for nonviolence. Gandhi absorbed these ideas of nonviolence from Ruskin and Tolstoy and Thoreau. Ruskin also introduced an element of Christian radicalism into his mind. Gandhi himself admitted that the dignity of labor as a moral ideal he absorbed from Ruskin. So there is a meeting of the East and the West in Gandhi. Some of the ideas which he had absorbed from traditional sources came to be reconfirmed by his acquaintance with Western thought. Tolstoy is particularly important in the sense that Gandhi certainly had an anarchist streak in him. But it was an anarchism that took a position against the powerful state, the might of the state power. We shall return to this question a bit later when we try to see Gandhi as a liberal who had become suspicious of the power of the state, who wished to create a different kind of state based on consensus, based on the participation of people in institutions of local government. So it is an alternative conception of the state. It was not a complete anarchy that this man was actually recommending or propagating. One of the central points, if we wish to see Gandhism or read Gandhism from the perspective of our own concerns, Gandhi was a practitioner of the politics of consensus. Even when he was actually suggesting the need for a confrontation with imperialism, there was a willingness to arrive at a certain kind of consensus with the enemy. And this politics of consensus was articulated through different images and visions. Take, for example, Gandhi's assessment of the caste system. On the face of it, it would seem that Gandhi was accepting caste inequality and caste divisions. But a man who had been fighting against untouchability, who had been able to, among the nationalist leaders, to make a great impression of the lower castes. A person who had endorsed the temple entry agitation, who had been associated with Harijan upliftment. So this man was not endorsing caste system in the way it existed, but caste system in the sense of a division of labor. The caste system in the sense of a certain interdependence between men performing different occupations in ancient India, a part of the Varna system that had existed before so many jatis began to emerge, had made an impression on his mind about the presence of an interdependent, harmonious world in India's antiquity, in which people lived in a relatively stable order. That is something which is important. Trying to look back into an ideal world of stability and harmony and contrasting this with the conflict of the modern times. To the extent that caste system provided a vision of stability, a vision of interdependence, Gandhi was actually talking about Varnasrama as something which was acceptable.
So how do you place Hind Swaraj in 1909 in the evolution of Gandhian thought about a harmonious society?
Yes, we'll come to this question a little later. But before that, we can spell out certain other features of the politics of consensus as well. For example, Gandhi's belief that if the landlords actually were freed of the enormous burden that imperialism had placed on them, the landlords would go back to that ideal world where between them and the peasants existed an interdependent relationship. Think about the trusteeship ideal, another dimension of the politics of consensus that he was espousing, that between labor and capital there was not necessarily a relationship of conflict. The owners, the mill owners, were required, as Gandhi suggested, to look after the welfare of the mill hands. And the mill hands, in turn, were expected to show some amount of loyalty to the mill owners. So the mill owners were to act as trustees of the mill hands. So it is not actually visualizing an unending conflict between the landlords and the peasants on the one hand and the mill owners and the mill hands on the other. It is actually once again talking about a harmony, a harmonious, stable social order in which the different classes were expected to collaborate with each other. This vision was at the back of his mind when he composed this particular tract. You were perfectly right in drawing attention to Hind Swaraj, which was composed in 1909. It was an articulation of this ideal of consensus, because behind it, or behind the ideas that he spelt out in the Hind Swaraj, existed that imagination of an ideal world in the past, uncontaminated by the divisive factors of modernity, uncontaminated by the conflicts that were unleashed by industrialism, that conflicts that were unleashed by the imposition of machine on man. So the ideal society in which the artisans, working as a part of the village society, of the village community, were providing necessary services to the villagers, and the villagers in turn were actually looking after their interests, maintaining them, giving them land for their sustenance. You know that at that time, nationalist economic history actually visualized this kind of an ideal world which came to be destroyed by imperialism, and in this you can also come across a kind of romantic denunciation of industrialism, something which Gandhi had absorbed from Ruskin. But more importantly, Gandhi once said that he came to tears when he read Arsida's famous economic history of India and came to know that the artisans lost their livelihood as a consequence of this onslaught of the industrial revolution in the Indian context. Gandhi wished to restore that village society, the village community, in which the artisans and the peasants were expected to work together in a harmonious society instead of being alienated by the forces of market, by the forces of industrialism. So in this, you have a certain imaginary vision of an ideal world contrasted with one's modern experience. And out of this emerges Gandhi's vision about village reconstruction. And Gandhi was not alone in holding this kind of a view. You come across similar sentiments also in Tagore. This was a major preoccupation with the nationalists at the turn of the century. So this actually brings us to this last point regarding the extent to which Gandhi actually subscribed to liberalism. Gandhi has often been labeled as a critic of modernity, as a critic of bourgeois civilization, as a critic of liberalism. Certainly certain elements of bourgeois social order were subjected to ruthless criticism by Gandhi. Industrialism is one of these. But at the same time, one has to realize that Gandhi was a liberal. Gandhi's liberalism was a certain kind of liberalism which continued to look suspiciously at the power of the state, and Gandhi wanted society to function as the main actor. Gandhi wanted local government to flourish, which would enable people to participate in decision making at the local level. Instead of concentrating power at the center, it was important for Gandhi to protect and nourish these institutions of local government at the local level based on the ideal of the village community of ancient times. And this ideal was sought to be recreated in this modern world through nourishment to institutions of local government, a position that many of the liberals in the later half of the 19th century took, including John Stuart Mill, who were extremely nervous or extremely suspicious about the growing power of the state, the capability of this modern state to inflict tyranny of the people, and to escape from that kind of unpalatable situation, the emphasis was put on institutions of local government. Certainly, you can see an element of liberalism in it, but this liberalism was different from the new kind of liberalism which you come across in Subhas Bose or Nehru, who met Haripura in the famous planning committee to decide on how the state would actually emerge as one of the main actors in economic reconstruction. Gandhi would not subscribe to that. Gandhi was in favor of freedom, individual freedom, the capability of individuals' elevation to a higher moral plane, and the protection of the individual from the many different kinds of tyranny to which he was likely to be exposed in the event of the growing concentration of power in the state.